What if the reason for anonymity wasn't because they knew this thing was going to be a success and that they needed, to protect their identity, but because they weren't prominent, they hadn't written any papers before, they were unknown, and they wanted their ideas to be taken seriously. There was, in fact, a $40 million betting pool on who the film would name, and Peter Todd was not on that list.
Well, Casey, this week we are talking about one of the greatest mysteries of the last 20 years on the internet. And no, I'm not talking about when you're going to write a good newsletter.
Wow. Well, you're coming in hot, Kevin, but you're right. This is a real whodunit. And it's the rare sort of happy whodunit, and that there's like no body anywhere. It's just the question of who created Bitcoin?
Yes. So for years now, there's been frantic speculation and investigation about the identity of Satoshi Nakamoto, the pseudonymous creator of Bitcoin, who published the Bitcoin white paper all the way back in 2008. No one has known who Satoshi Nakamoto is or was, but there have been lots of different theories floated around over the years.
Yeah, you know how like every few years they reboot Spider-Man and just like cast a new person in the role of Spider-Man? That's sort of how it feels like it's been with Satoshi Nakamoto. Every 3 years or so, some journalist comes forward and says, aha, I finally got it. And then 3 years later, somebody comes in and does it all over again.
Yes. So this week, we got a new potential Satoshi Nakamoto.
There's a new Nakamoto in town, and like other previous Nakamotos, he's denying that he's Nakamoto.
Right, yeah. Right. So this new Satoshi Nakamoto candidate comes to us courtesy of Cullen Hoback. Cullen is a documentary filmmaker, and his new movie just came out this week. It's called Money Electric, The Bitcoin Mystery. Cullen previously did a movie about the QAnon conspiracy theory called Q Into the Storm, which was an attempt to sort of unravel that mystery of who was behind this big conspiracy theory. And this time...
And we should say, in that case, I think they did actually nail the person.
Yes.
Yeah.
I think a lot of people found his conclusion in that film very credible. And I watched this movie. I was given a screener of it several days before it came out, and I watched it over the weekend. And I went in very skeptical. I thought, oh, here we go. There's another one of these sort of theories about Satoshi Nakamoto. And by the end of the film, I was fairly convinced that Cullen had done it again, that he had actually uncovered the identity of Satoshi Nakamoto.
And who does he think Satoshi Nakamoto is, Kevin?
So Cullen makes the case in his film that Satoshi Nakamoto is a guy named Peter Todd. Peter is not one of the usual suspects whose name gets floated a lot during these Satoshi Nakamoto investigations, but he was an early contributor to the Bitcoin project. But I was actually more impressed by the kind of other thing that the film did, which is just that it convinced me that who Satoshi Nakamoto is actually matters.
Which is what?
Which is, obviously there's sort of the financial angle, right? This is a person who presumably controls, billions of dollars worth of this cryptocurrency now. And so I think it's important to understand, who that person is. But this is also like a movement, like whatever you think of Bitcoin, whether you think it's a scam or it's worthless or whatever, like it has had a profound impact on global finance. It's, worth $1 trillion. It's this $1 trillion industry. It's also influencing a lot of central banks around the world and how they're thinking about starting their own digital currencies. Obviously, it's created this tribe of kind of Bitcoin true believers who are now very influential in U.S. politics. So I just think it's had a big impact on the world, even if you are not a person who cares about Bitcoin itself. I think you will care about this film because it just illustrates the many ways that this single invention has sort of rippled out into the world.
Absolutely. And, I really agree with you that who Satoshi is does matter, even if you're not a Bitcoin person yourself. For my own part, I remain skeptical that Peter Todd is Satoshi, although I do think the film is a valiant effort to uncover the identity of Satoshi. And if nothing else, if you watch this film, I think you'll have a lot to talk about with all your Bitcoin friends.
All right, let's bring in Cullen Hoback. Cullen Hoback, welcome to Hard Fork.
Excited to be here. Thanks for having me.
Can you just start by explaining why you took on this story, the pursuit of the identity of Satoshi Nakamoto? Like, what convinced you that this was worth this many years of your life to try to figure out who Satoshi Nakamoto is?
Well, in the beginning, I wasn't actually convinced, because it's one of those mysteries that's just been hanging for so long. And it's like you start to think, well, like if it could have been solved, it probably would have been solved. But I put together a list of 5 people who seemed like likely suspects and said, okay, if I can get access to maybe one of these guys, it would make sense to start picking around the edges of this story.
And what was your pitch to those people when you started approaching them? Because a lot of these people, they've been hearing all the speculation about who is Satoshi for like more than a decade at this point. And I'm sure reporters have reached out to them hundreds of times trying to piece together various fragments of evidence. So how did you approach these people who you thought might be Satoshi or might be connected to Satoshi? What did you tell them you were working on, and how did they respond?
I mean, I try to be very upfront. I said this is a story that's looking at the origins of Bitcoin to understand how it became what it became, but then also perhaps understand Satoshi's motives and maybe figure out who Satoshi was. So this is how I kind of pitched it. And the first interview I did was with Adam Back. He's the cryptographer who invented something called Hashcash, which is really one of the key technological aspects of Bitcoin. And Adam Back was also the first person that Satoshi had ever reached out to. So that was the jumping in point. I go to Malta, spend some days there, and get to know him. And his answers were pretty suspicious. And after that, I said, all right, well, maybe there is a story here.
Yeah. So let's talk about the investigation into the identity of Satoshi Nakamoto. Tell us about Peter Todd.
So Peter Todd was a self-taught coder, a super genius. He starts communicating with Adam Back and some of the other cypherpunks at the age of 15. Now, Bitcoin's white paper, the sort of blueprint for Bitcoin, is released in 2008, and Bitcoin itself is launched in 2009. Peter Todd would have been 23 at the time. But a lot of cryptographers, they have their big breakthroughs when they're younger. If you look at Ethereum, Vitalik, he was 19 when he came up with the proposal for Ethereum. So I think this fits. This sort of fits within kind of the history of cypherpunk inventions that people come up with this stuff in their youth. And Peter Todd, I mean, prior to Bitcoin, he was in art school, but he was very focused in those early years. There's these old emails you can find where he was trying to turn Hashcash, which is Adam Back's invention, into a real currency, like into a workable version of cash for the internet, something that would maintain that sense of privacy that you get when you buy something with cash, just online, right?
In your film, Peter also comes across as like quite ideological about sort of the need for internet money and private money. And I wonder if you could share a little bit about what was that philosophy that was driving him from such a young age to want something like a Hashcash or a Bitcoin to exist.
I was also very curious about what he was like as a kid. It was not easy to find some of these details around him. I think he's best described as, he said it himself, he's a young libertarian. I think he self-describes more as a soft libertarian. And
that's a libertarian who doesn't go to the gym?
Yeah. I think that's an apt description. Yeah. I mean, libertarianism is a big umbrella, right? So yeah, you have your libertarians who don't go to the gym. You have your anarcho-capitalists. You have ones who don't believe that any state should exist at all. Peter Todd is not one of those. He's someone who understands that governments will exist.
Got it.
But he also stands in opposition to them.
And the breadcrumbs that led you to Peter Todd, I think we should just say they're complicated, right? There's a reason this film is as long as it is, because it does take a lot of background information to just be able to understand how you started piecing together the clues that led you to Peter Todd as the suspect for Satoshi Nakamoto. But can you just give us, like, what is your best piece of evidence that led you to claim that Peter Todd and Satoshi Nakamoto are the same person?
Sure. So Peter Todd is masterful at muddying the waters. And in the film, you get to go on this journey where you're conversing with people who have interacted with Todd in the past and have been disoriented by this. Some people think he works for he's a government agent trying to undermine Bitcoin. There's all these wild narratives that have formed around him. But the key piece of evidence and the thing that started to unlock this for me, he makes this post in 2010. And he's only made 3 posts on the forums up until this point. And that post really reads like a continuation of a thought of what Satoshi had just written. It's like an hour and a half later, and Peter Todd is the only one to add on to this post with a deep knowledge of how the system that Satoshi was describing was working, to the point of just making like a small modification to...
He's basically correcting
that post.
Satoshi.
It's a correction post. It's a correction post. Yeah, I think that's the best way to put it. And what it looked like to me is that Peter had logged out of the Satoshi account, logged into this new account, not realized he'd logged in, and written this correction post. And then both he and Satoshi evaporate after this. And clearly it indicates an unbelievable degree of involvement at that time. To be able to correct Satoshi on a very minute detail about something called replace by fee, which is a technical solution that he would add to Bitcoin himself years later. But he would invent this whole character and construct this whole wild narrative with an email hack and all of this stuff just so basically he could have an excuse to write replace by fee. So we're talking about a guy who loves playing these kinds of games, loves playing with alternate identities. And I think that speaks to why this mystery has stood for so long.
What's your personal level of confidence that Peter is Satoshi?
I mean, look, I think that based on the evidence, we make a hell of a case. I'm very confident in the case that we make, and ultimately, I mean, I'm hoping that the audience will watch and come to their own conclusions. But all of the evidence that I've got lines up with him. When you parse through all of the evidence, you look at his history, the timing, the writing style. There was a recent batch of emails that came out as a byproduct of a court case against a guy who was claiming to be Satoshi, Craig Wright, who is not Satoshi. He was proven to be a fraud in court. But in order to prove him as a fraud, some of the folks who were messaging with Satoshi very early on had to release their emails. And within those emails, it shows someone who is kind of struggling with cash as being the person behind the Satoshi account, and someone who has kind of, troll-like lexicon. He uses the word retarded. And I think that Satoshi saying a word like that just casually really starts to narrow down your options on who Satoshi might be. And I think using a word like that also, it's not something that the community wanted to imagine about Satoshi. I'm sure it's part of why they hadn't released those emails.
Yeah, for me, there's 2 things that I always get hung up on in the conversation about, who is Satoshi. One is we live in a society where everyone wants credit for everything, even things that they didn't do, right? Craig Wright apparently was one of these people. So the idea that the person who created this, global phenomenon, maybe changed the course of history, does not want to take credit for in public, it's just always been very hard for me to understand. The second thing is, and as your film goes into in great detail, is that Satoshi owns Satoshi owns Bitcoin's worth at least $60 billion right now for its current selling price, could be worth much more in the future. The idea that, someone who, as you just said, Cullen, was quite poor, would just not want access to the $60 billion leads me to feel like this person has to be dead, whoever this is.
Well, I think this is why a lot of folks in the space want to believe that that he's dead. Why wouldn't you have tapped that massive chest? But here's what I'll say is that there's a pattern that was revealed by an error in Bitcoin's code that showed what is believed to be Satoshi's stash of 1 million or so Bitcoin. That bug gets fixed in 2013. Satoshi could have easily been mining long after that. Satoshi could have also had another computer or other things that didn't fit that pattern up until that time. What I'm saying is I think that Satoshi could be perfectly well off without having to touch any of the stash that's a part of that pattern. Right. So that's point one. I think the first thing, point two would be, why not take the credit for it? I think the motivations over time have shifted of like why to protect Satoshi's identity. We make this case in the film, and this is what I believe. Most people have thought Satoshi used anonymity because they knew that Bitcoin was going to be this massive success, right? But in the beginning, the cryptography mailing list, the cryptographers there largely poo-pooed the idea. But something that I hadn't considered for a large portion of the investigation is, what if the reason for anonymity wasn't because they knew this thing was going to be a success and that they needed, to protect their identity, but because they weren't prominent, they hadn't written any papers before, they were unknown, and they wanted their ideas to be taken seriously. And this is another part of this sort of cypherpunk ethos is like, oh, well, if you use anonymity, then the ideas can be judged at face value rather than using credibility as the metric. So, and when you think about it in that light, it makes a lot more sense why Satoshi might have needed said anonymity. Now, once it became a success, the motivation might shift, right? At that point, you go, okay, well, this thing is getting bigger than I was expecting. Or maybe you want to be able to kind of continue working on it, but sort of living your life, in a kind of Clark Kent Superman fashion. Where, there's this Satoshi character, but then also over here, I'm actually, I'm a real person kind of reporting on myself or whatever. So I think that's the sort of dynamic at play here. I believe that Satoshi disappears and then Peter Todd reemerges and injects himself in the narrative, and kind of interacts with his alter ego. I mean, this is something I saw in Q as well. It's almost like the people who run these anonymous accounts can't help but interact with their alter egos in some way, bake themselves into the narrative, because it makes them look, I think in their minds, perhaps less suspicious. And then I think as time went by, I mean, Peter really muddied the waters, made himself look like the anti-Satoshi. And if there were people in Bitcoin who knew this secret, they would probably think it's bad for Bitcoin if he did end up being Satoshi.
Right, because he's not like he's a pretty controversial figure in the Bitcoin community already. Even before your film came out, he was sort of seen as like a troll or just someone who was like had a lot of controversial opinions about things related to crypto and other things too. So not someone who you'd want to say, like, this is the person who started our whole movement.
Although, if you are that troll, to me, it's like all the more reason to be like, by the way, I'm Satoshi, because that immediately gives you so much more credibility in all the online fights that you're starting.
Right.
Well, you saw up until the film released, he did that all the time. He'd say, oh, I'm Satoshi, anytime someone would ask him, and they would just brush it off and move on.
Right. But he was not someone who was...
It's part of the troll-like behavior, though.
Exactly. So. They sort of do this, like, I am Spartacus thing, where they all say, I am Satoshi, as a means to, like, preserve the identity of the real Satoshi. I mean, the scene that is sort of the climactic scene in the film is this confrontation where you basically, are interviewing Peter Todd and Adam Back, his kind of mentor, and you present him with your case that he is Satoshi Nakamoto. Walk us through what happened there and how he reacted.
Yeah, so it was a bit of a challenge getting both Adam and Peter to be in the same place at the same time to answer these questions. And I felt that that was really the only way that we could get to the bottom of this, if there was any way at all. And Peter loves to go caving. So I was like, all right, maybe I can get these guys to go on an adventure if we find some crazy, Soviet era ruins. So we tracked those down, and I suggested to Peter, maybe we should go on this adventure. Do you think you get Adam to go with us? And so kind of a producing miracle, but they both agreed. And so we drive out to this steelworks, it's like a decrepit steelworks factory. And pretty early on, I start going through the evidence. I start with Adam back and all of the reasons why it looked like Adam was Satoshi, unless he was covering for someone. And then in that moment, Peter once again kind of deflects and says, no, well, actually, you're missing all of the evidence that does point at Adam. So I started asking, okay, like, why did you write pro tip if you want to, if you start a revolutionary currency, you should frame someone back in 2014. And eventually coming to this alter ego that he had invented and seemingly invented, and trying to get to the bottom of that, why he did that, and then eventually putting together this theory and holding the camera as steady as I can as I just paint the theory as directly as I can, and watch his reaction, watch Adam's reaction, see how he's kind of absorbing what I'm saying. He's at a loss for words, and this is not a guy who is often at a loss for words. I'd never seen that happen before.
He's sweating. I think like he's maybe not literally sweating, but like it's you see like how surprised and nervous he is, and he's sort of stammering, and he can't really figure out how he wants to respond.
Yeah,
I mean, that must have just been a very high adrenaline moment for you holding the camera there after 3 years of work to finally be sort of like confronting your suspect.
I have this rule that I tell myself when I'm out filming, which is how I feel on set. Let's call it a set, but how I feel when I'm filming with subjects is how an audience will feel, that it will translate. And yes, the amount of sort of butterflies, tension in my stomach, the adrenaline, I think it translates, as does his intensity and his response.
Yeah, I mean, in the film, he does eventually, after he's done stammering, he does eventually say, like, I'm not Satoshi. He does not like confess to being Satoshi, and I've been emailing him a little bit this week. He says he's not Satoshi, that you got it all wrong, that he sort of accused you of being a conspiracy theorist,
Well,
and
okay.
And I just wonder if you have like a response to that.
Well, it doesn't surprise me. He's had a year and some change to figure out how he was going to respond. He's had something pinned to his profile since we had that interaction. In the months that followed, he tried to minimize the correction post. He's a master of game theory, and I view all of this as just more of his game theory and distraction. I think that the evidence is helpful. It pointed us in the direction, but his reaction in many respects is even better evidence.
I will say that like doing something really big and then not wanting credit or attention, there is something Canadian about that. I do think that is a point in the favor of the Peter Todd case.
Why don't you think Peter Todd has been a suspect? I mean, thousands of people have been looking into this for years and years and years, and like Peter Todd was not in the top 10 or maybe even the top 20 suspects of who Satoshi could be. So
I think that he's really become adept at figuring out how to muddy the waters in such a way that even with a case that's being made like this, with a lot of strong evidence, the community isn't prepared to even entertain it. There were a couple of instances where people had brought it up, but they would just get laughed off the forums. So he had been suspected occasionally, but for the most part, it was just discounted.
Right. I mean, I think we should just say, like, in the interest of fairness, this is not like a smoking gun case, right? In order to definitively prove that Peter Todd is Satoshi Nakamoto, you would have to do something like catch him using the private keys to Satoshi's Bitcoin wallets or something like that. But let's say you're right, and Peter Todd is Satoshi Nakamoto, and the evidence that you've laid out holds up. Do you think that changes anything for Bitcoin or its future?
Well, I think the best outcome from this would be if, say, in the next couple of weeks, Satoshi burns the entire stash, burns the million or so coins.
Burn meaning like destroys in a cryptographically irreversible way.
Cryptographically in a public way for all to see on the blockchain, which is Bitcoin's public record-keeping service. Anyone would be able to see it. It'd be totally verifiable. It'd be the best thing for Satoshi and the best thing for Bitcoin. It would be a almost Christ-like thing to be able to do something like that, or it's like throwing the one ring into the volcano. But assuming they still have access to the keys, all of this goes away if that were to happen.
Yeah. Yeah, this could end up being a very costly documentary for Satoshi Nakamoto. It could cost him $60 billion.
Yeah, I mean, this is one of those things. It's like, I mean, do you want to know? I think everyone should ask. Like, if somebody controlled 1/20th of all the gold on Earth, would you want to know who that was? And when it comes to Bitcoin, it's like, all right, well, someone may or may not still have control of the keys to 1/20th of all the digital gold on Earth.
Yeah,
which is really what
think
Bitcoin
it would
is
deflate,
becoming.
I think it would deflate the community if they knew that it was, because so much of the myth around Bitcoin and the reason that people love it is because it does have this kind of murky origin story, like, people talk about it like an immaculate conception. This thing just sort of basically sprang out of the ether into existence. And of course it didn't. Someone came up with it. Someone wrote the white paper. And I just think if you bring if you pull back the curtain and it's just some guy, I think that does actually maybe weaken the case for Bitcoin over time.
I think you're right in the short run. I think that it's this thing that maybe in an immediate sense, people would react and go, "Oh God, like Satoshi is a human with all of these human problems," and then as that might affect markets. Not my problem, but it might affect markets. But I think in the long run, this mystery actually is also is starting to become an albatross hanging around Bitcoin's neck. And getting over that would be probably a benefit to Bitcoin, just to have some resolution there. Also, I think this is something worth noting, which is that a lot of people you mentioned Dorian earlier, Hal Finney's wife, a lot of folks have had their privacy invaded over the years so that Satoshi could keep theirs, and there's an easy way to stop that, which is just to come clean, to burn the coins. So I think the ball's really in Satoshi's court here. And I think there's some clear steps that could be made to just bring this all to a poetic conclusion.
Yeah. Well, Cullen, if you have run out of internet mysteries to solve and you need a new one, I would just suggest that you look into the redeeming qualities of Casey Newton. People have been looking for those for years, and no one's cracked the case. So if you need an idea for a next film,
it might be more than 3 years for that, though. So it'll take a while.
All right. Well, I'll get on the Wayback Machine and see what I can find.
All right. Thanks so much, Cullen.
Thanks, Cullen.
All right. Thank you, Kevin. Thank you, Casey.
Hey, that's the end of this clip. If you liked what you saw, head on over to our page and subscribe, and you can get the full podcast. We do a show like this almost every week on tech and the future. Head on over there now and subscribe.